So I think just by starting off with some facts and figures that I think we are already all aware of, such as the fact that, most of international migrants originate from middle income countries, that African countries should technically be vested in creating and enabling regional migration management strategies, because up to 63% of the continent's migrants remain within the continent itself. So we have a very high level of intra-regional mobility in sub-Saharan Africa. Just an illustration that, you can see the difference. North African countries, still a large amount, 14 million that end up in Europe, whereas with sub-Saharan Africa, we're still talking majority, movement within the continent itself. I'm sure that Joe and Nick would be happy to share the slides with anyone if there's a request for that. And then again, with refugee trends, if you look at it, 86% hosted in developing countries. That fundamentally, we've got 5 major countries that are contributing to the total number of refugees worldwide. And that fundamentally, I think the point that I'm trying to make with these graphs is that fundamentally, refugee and migration management is really something that affects developing countries far more than developed countries, and that there should be some sort of and that this is a factor that needs to be thought about when we look at something like the Compact for Migration and the Compact for Refugees. So just an important point to remember that both the Compact for Migration and Refugees, the process of finalizing it is concluded. They were both finalized between 2017, 2018. But just to give a brief overview in terms of what they are and their purposes, both of them are rooted in the signing of the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants. And this gave rise to 2 different compacts, the Global Compact for Migration and the Global Compact for Refugees. They are aligned with the SDG goals. They're looking at really trying to find global responses that promote better management of refugees and of migrants. So the GCM had 3 phases. The first was consultations, the second was a stock-taking approach, and the third one was the intergovernmental negotiations. And the purpose was really to establish that international cooperation, to give states the leeway and the flexibility to implement migration management as they saw fit. And then also really, you can think about it, the GCM as kind of being a menu, right, of options, policy options that countries could implement domestically while still abiding by their international responsibilities as far as this goes. In comparison, the GCR kind of has the same approach, but obviously refugees with a focus on refugees, responsibility sharing, more predictable response, helping to what do they refer to it as burden sharing. I don't really like that word, but responsibility sharing is probably a better term. And there's kind of 4 key objectives to the GCR, which is easing the pressure on host societies and communities, enhancing refugee self-reliance, expanding third country solutions, and then of course supporting conditions for the return of refugees in safety and dignity. And then accompanying the CRRF is obviously unique. If you don't have implementation plans and if you don't have programs of actions, then of course these documents just remain on paper. So we have a program of action that is supposed to help member states meet the objectives of the Refugee Compact, which includes, meeting every 4 years at the Global Refugee Forum to take stock of what's working, what's not working, sharing lessons learning, and finding out better ways in which refugee management can take place at a global level. But there are some key areas of concern, and I think it's important to remember that while the GCR and GCM do have some interesting and good forward-looking initiatives, it's also important to remember that there is some obvious holes in the way that they have been created and the way in what they're looking to achieve. So the first is that the GCR is spearheaded by the UNHCR, which is, the human rights, it's the UN body for refugees. But the GCM was actually a state-led process, which is it changes completely the spectrum of how issues are approached. It changes what is on the table and what's not on the table. And it was co-facilitated by Switzerland and Mexico. So the IOM's role really was only to provide technical expertise. So what gets discussed and what gets decided upon in the GCM is very different and potentially one could say less ambitious. It's important to remember that the GCM does not remove states' sovereignty or their right to determine how to actually deal with migrants in their own countries. And it really doesn't, it's a kind of a repackaging of existing customary law. So it doesn't necessarily create fundamentally new legal obligations for member states either. And likewise, the GCR is also not legally binding and also doesn't have any enforcement mechanisms. So this raises concerns about whether, UN member states, whether countries in general can actually be trusted to do good and be good for the betterment of all, when there isn't really enforcement mechanisms and when documents or frameworks like this aren't legally binding. And I think, what's going to happen when the elephant in the room, which is climate change refugees, become a problem that leaders can no longer ignore. And I don't know if the GCM or the GCR has enough of solutions for that. So like I said, this was a process that took place between 2017 and 2018. Where we are right now, we have the UN that has established a network on migration, which is really to support member states in the implementation and the follow-up of the migration compact. Right now, there's been regional reviews that have been conducted this year. So ESCAP, which I think is in Asia, has been held theirs in March, and UNECA held the African consultations in August. And the feedback generated from these regional consultations will feed into the first International Migration Review Forum taking place next year. Some of the findings that came out from the Africa Group's consultations include challenges in implementation. Unsurprisingly, also because of the COVID pandemic, it's made it harder to implement the vision of the GCM. There's also, it's important, as we all know, that migration is not something by itself. It always works in tandem with a whole bunch of other issues. So migration and trade, migration and portability of social benefits, migration and labor, migration and employment rights, and so on and so on. So there's been a lot of intersectionalities that have been raised in the context of migration on the African continent that stakeholders voiced, which includes trafficking, missing migrants, detention, and remittances, reintegration. Those kinds of issues came up in the feedback from the Africa Group. So these are the 5 theme areas for the network on migration that the UN has established, and it's got 3 core goals. The first is like creating a space where you can have virtual learnings and lesson sharing and learning from peer countries. The second is, of course, the regional discussions for the International Migration Review Forum. And the third is the Startup Fund, which is currently valued at $12 million, which is to actually implement projects in the countries across these 5 thematic areas. So there is some money being put behind these compacts, which is good. It helps with the implementation, but of course, how successful the implementation is becomes another story. So these are sort of broad concerns for African countries, and it's not necessarily linked to the GCM or the GCR. It's just kinds of challenges that for many African countries, it has been a reality long before even these compacts came into being. Of course, there's the obvious financial and technical resources to host refugee communities. We've seen in South Africa the social tensions that can arise, the xenophobic attacks. It takes time to implement and domesticate, if you so wish to do so, a lot of these international treaties or international customary law, if you choose to take this on, and that can lead to challenges at a domestic policymaking level. We know that high-level commitment to a process is one thing, but the way in which local government actually implements on the ground is totally different. And the question is whether there is that kind of service rollout, whether there is a shifting of the narrative around migrants and refugee communities takes place at a local level, and whether local governments are equipped for that is also another question. And then, of course, we have challenges in accessing data, which means that there are challenges in them making evidence-based policymaking on the continent. So in terms of the CRF and the refugee compact, there's an ODI paper, and this is linked, so you guys can find the paper through the hyperlink. And they did a review on implementation of the CRF in Kenya, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Uganda, and it has not had very mixed results, that there hasn't really been the kind of self-reliance that the CRF has imagined, that development financing has not necessarily being as forthcoming as it should be to ease the responsibility sharing or the challenges that face host communities. And to the previous slide, that questions around capacity of national systems and local governments to absorb these additional responsibilities, there also has been insufficient attention paid to those requirements. So, I mean, this is, I don't want it to sound like it's all negative, and it's not. And the question is, implementation is really is really where the devil of the detail is. And I think that what we need to really assess is what can be done in a local context, where are the lower hanging fruits, what is achievable and what isn't, and where can we start to craft, if not continental, but at least regional refugee management strategies and migration management strategies, because you need to start locally in order to expand out. So these are some ideas that I had, and it comes from some of the work that we've been doing on migration management recently, and also from what the GCR and the GCM have envisaged. And I think a lot of it has to do with shifting the narrative, evidence-based decision-making. What is the role of civil society and private sector? Can they play a role in promoting positive outcomes in terms of migration and refugee management? And, is it better to, instead of having grand political aspirations in AU documents, perhaps rather to look at something that is bite-sized, something that can be implemented, something that can bring positive feedback from a policy-making perspective, and then move on to, slowly build on that picture instead of grand visions that do not necessarily get implemented, get brought to light.